You're listening to Sarah Talk. It's political.
This rhetoric about make America great again. Tell me when America was great and we'll go back there. I'm going with you.
Critical.
Hang on, let me I'm gonna change some words here. All right, ready? Adults with religious confusion who truly believe in a higher power that created us and actually cares what we do with our penises and vaginas should be treated with care, compassion, and kindness, but must not be officially affirmed in their confusion, no matter how sincerely held. Fuck you.
And positively LGBT positive.
In many states, you can still be evicted from housing simply for being gay or transgender. Stand and fight with us.
Oh, and occasionally completely absurd.
I don't know if you've ever seen a lightning bug, but he flies around with a flame, but light coming out of his behind. The lightning bug got a flame coming out of his butt.
It's a beautiful night tonight. All the sodomites are out.
And now, from Orlando, Florida, your host, Sarah Austin.
Welcome to Sarah Talk. I'm Sarah Austin. Becca and MK in the house.
Hello. Hey.
Hey, let's talk about penises.
Yeah.
Now, Michael, calm down. Calm down.
All right.
This is a topic that I've been wanting to tackle for a long time now, and I've said this on the show before. One of the major regrets that I have in my life is having my son circumcised. And I've developed some pretty strong opinions on this. And I know that there are a lot of people on the other side with strong opinions too. So being a show that tries to, look at the facts and do the research and present the evidence, I wanted to do that and see what the medical community really has to say about it. So today we are joined by Georganne Chapin, the Executive Director of Intact America. Georganne, welcome to Sarah Talk.
Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. So first, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your own background?
Sure. I'll start with my demographic information. I'm a 65-year-old woman. I'm a mother of one grown son. He is 36 and he is an intact man, which means that for many, many decades, I've been opposed to cutting off body parts from people who cannot consent to it.
Yeah.
So that's been really my belief for as long as I can remember, and I don't really know exactly why I came to that, given that so many other people accepted circumcision as normal. And then over the years, I just became more interested in why we do this to boys when we are so appalled at having it done to girls. And I also became much more aware of the long-term damage and the long-term effects of being deprived of this body part when you're a baby, and the long-term benefits of keeping the body that you want, that you're entitled to, right?
Yeah.
People should be able to make their own decisions. So when I was, and I'm a lawyer, although I never practiced law, I was a healthcare executive for many years. Actually, still am, run a small nonprofit healthcare company. Mm-hmm. And everything I've, done and believed in my life has just continued to reinforce my feeling that this is a terrible human rights violation and something we have no right to do to somebody else. That's really, that's where I come from. That's where Intact America comes from. Intact America, which is on the web and on Facebook.
Yeah. Now, when we had our son 7 years ago, we hadn't really discussed circumcision in a lot of great detail ahead of time. And then a nurse shows up and says, "Are you going to do this?" And you're just kind of left on your own to decide. I would have loved to have someone in the medical background and no religious bias there to talk through this whole thing with us. I mean, they provide very detailed breastfeeding support now. I feel like we could just do a better job, about educating parents about circumcision, which is kind of the point of this episode. So I want to get to the damage that happens to kids during circumcision in just a moment. But first, let's walk through a couple of the common arguments, particularly the myths that are offered up in support of circumcision, if you don't mind. So,
no, not at all.
The first one, we shared one of the memes that you sent over. We shared on our Instagram, and one of our followers commented, quote, It helps reduce the risk of certain STIs, helps prevent penile cancer, and also prevents the incredibly painful swelling of the foreskin, end quote. And I was aware of the prominent idea that uncut penises are harder to keep clean and then would cause more infections. Like I've heard of before, but the cancer and swelling thing was new for me. So I'll kind of let you get all of that.
Right. I mean, and what was the first one? Oh, STIs.
Yeah.
No evidence, actually. Absolutely no evidence that a foreskin is associated in any way, positively or negatively, with the acquisition of sexually transmitted infections. That's simply unproven. There are studies that show some advantage to having foreskin, and some studies that show no advantage to having foreskin. But there's absolutely no convincing epidemiological evidence associating the presence of a foreskin with increased STIs. Penile cancer is one that's been trotted out for decades, and penile cancer is one of the rarest cancers among human beings. Occurs almost exclusively in very old men. It can occur whether you have a foreskin or not. It occurs in another part of the penis. And the American Cancer Society very explicitly says that circumcision should not be practiced as a way of preventing penile cancer. Penile cancer is a fraction less, way, 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 way less common, for example, than breast cancer, and we don't go cutting off women's breasts routinely to prevent breast cancer.
Right.
The swelling of the foreskin's funny. That's kind of funny if it wasn't so ridiculous to think that people would follow that advice. Any body part that you have can get infected or damaged and can be incredibly painful, right? Ingrown toenails, incredibly painful, like horrible, right?
Yeah.
Well, we don't go cutting off people's big toes to prevent the incredibly painful swelling and infection of their big toes. Appendicitis is incredibly painful and dangerous, but we don't, routinely remove people's appendixes. So that's kind of funny because it really falls into the whole paradigm of this is a bad body part and we really ought to get rid of it sooner rather than later. And of course, there's no such thing as a bad body part. The body is evolved over millions of years. All mammals have foreskins, male and female mammals have foreskins, in people, the female foreskin is generally called the clitoral hood, and it's there for a reason. And in boys, the foreskin is boys and men, the foreskin serves in early life a very strong protective function, keeping pathogens from getting into the urinary tract. And in adults, it serves an incredibly important procreative function in that it enhances pleasure for both partners.
Which is generally the reason why religion wants to get rid of things, is to control your sexual.
Yeah, that is definitely a very big part of the history of male circumcision and female genital cutting in America. We have a very obscure and hidden history of female genital mutilation in this country. Kind of went by the wayside in the 1970s and 80s, but it was not unheard of for doctors to remove American girls' clitorises, usually as a result of their parents complaining about them masturbating.
Wow.
So we just we've completely obliterated that part of our medical history. I wanted to, if it's okay, Sarah, at all, I just wanted to address directly your introduction, which is to get, medical information and talk to a medical expert. Circumcision is not a medical procedure. We should just dispense with that. The fact that a doctor does something does not make it a clinically valid medical procedure, right?
That is a fantastic point. Yes.
Yeah. Don't forget that circumcision is carried out among religions all over the world by ritual practitioners.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, in the U.S. also, you don't have to be a licensed health professional to do circumcision. The line is actually quite blurry because you can bring some dude into your house who has a religious background to cut off your son's foreskin, but you can't cut your son's foreskin off yourself.
Right.
Right? You're not allowed to do that. And in fact, people have been arrested for trying that, usually when it's botched, of course, right? But it's not a valid medical procedure. It's simply something that crept into fee-for-service medicine, any more than ear piercing is, right? People, I mean, when I had my ears pierced at the age of, I don't know, I was a teenager, my parents were very concerned about infection and getting it done right. And I remember going to the doctor and having him kind of with this, I don't want to say despairing look, but this sort of kind of, what the heck am I doing this for? Like, this is not what I was trained to do, you know, pierce this kid's ears. There was no discussion about, you know, whether I was of an age to do it or whatever. But, just the fact that a doctor does something doesn't mean it's medical. And then what happens is once something has become the purview of the medical profession, like it did in the U.S., then it becomes up to the medical profession to continue to justify it. Because after all, they're doing it, they're charging for it, right? Yeah. And they got to justify it somehow. But it's not a valid medical procedure.
Yeah.
It is the removal of a totally normal, totally healthy body part from somebody who is completely vulnerable because of his size and, you know, an inability to resist other than by screaming. That doesn't make medicine.
We've talked on the show before too about, and particularly in New York, there is a problem that's becoming rampant more and more with the Orthodox rabbis who are passing on. If you're worried about STIs, you need to worry about these Orthodox rabbis who are passing on infections to these young boys, because in this Orthodox tradition, once the foreskin is cut, then they put it in their mouth.
They suck the penis to stop the blood flow.
And if anybody else did that, we would lock them up, by the way.
Yeah, that is true. So yes, and actually it's interesting because 100 years ago there was in New York also, which is where the ultra-Orthodox population that does this is mostly located. 100 years ago it was syphilis that before we had a cure for syphilis, and there was actually quite a lot of syphilis in the adult population, and the rabbis, the moyals, were passing on syphilis this way to babies by the mouth to penis contact. These days it's herpes. Yep. Because syphilis is very low incidence. So it's herpes, and herpes can be fatal. A herpes infection that is annoying and an inconvenience in an adult can be fatal or cause blindness to infants. So there's that. You're right. There's that.
Then there are some arguments that don't even try to be medically based, like, you know, some fathers that say things like, it'll be weird if it doesn't look like mine.
Right.
Or that he won't look like his friends, or he'll be
I always say to
teased.
that, well, you have brown eyes and your son has green eyes. You're going to give him back?
Yeah.
You know, who are you going to give him? Yeah. I mean, our kids don't look like us, especially. I mean, I couldn't tell you what my mother's genitals look like and whether I look like her. And it's just, that's absurd also. Let me just, go back to the hygiene thing, because you did mention that. That's also, you know, of course, a total myth that's
hard to keep clean.
For one thing, in an infant, it's much harder to clean a newly circumcised penis because you have a wound.
Yes.
So in addition to all the other things you have to do with a newborn, and you know this, you have a son who's what, 8, you say?
Yeah, he's 7 now. Yeah.
7, right? So, you know, having a baby is, you know, lots of work. There's a lot of stuff to do, and to have to do wound care for a newborn is insane, right? Yep. So that hygiene argument is another kind of reflex, rhetorical point that people make, because nobody's going to answer you back, well, I don't care if my kid's dirty. You know, instead they're going to say, oh yeah, you know, easier to keep clean. It's easier to keep an intact penis clean in a baby. And I always say, you know, if you can teach your kid to, clean his ears, brush his teeth, blow his nose,
right? Wipe his butt,
become a wipe his butt, become a scientist,
right.
Become an airplane pilot. You can teach him to wash his penis, especially since, having a foreskin and pulling it back to do whatever, feels really good. So most boys really don't have any trouble figuring out how to rinse off their penis in the shower. Once that foreskin becomes retractable, and up until that time, I mean, that is the self-pleasuring that males routinely engage in. And so it really isn't, that's the myth, is that it's somehow cleaner.
Sure.
Of course, if we talk about anybody's genitals, I mean, women's genitals have lots of folds, and we have an infant daughter too.
We've got both sides of that. Yeah.
Right. And and that argument, by the way, is one of the arguments that's used in the parts of the world where female genital mutilation is practiced, that it's cleaner, that it's more, and the word for cutting girls' genitals is or for the ceremony and for the process is the Arab word for purity. So it's a purification ritual. And that's essentially how we treat circumcision in the U.S. We just don't use that word. We use hygiene, which is, it's somehow a more scientific sounding word than purification, but it's exactly the same principle.
Now, my own thoughts have evolved over the past 7 years. And again, this is something that you talk about in some of the informational resources on your website, intactamerica.org. And that's this. I realize it's a dangerous and painful procedure. I realize we've only been doing it for so long because God. I realize it wrongly gets portrayed as normal, especially in America. But the one thing I think that really changed me on this, and we touched on this earlier, that my son was unable to give consent to a major elective surgery, basically. It wasn't like he needed a hole in his heart repaired. This was absolutely an elective thing, and he had no choice in the matter. And that's probably where most of my guilt comes from, I think.
Right, yeah. And then he has to live with the consequences forever.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I have, over the years since as I said, I always thought this was an issue, and I talked to lots of people over, my lifetime. But since I started Intact America, by the way, together with a group of other people who've been working on this issue, I didn't do this single-handedly at all. We have a huge movement right now. But since I started Intact America, I've probably spoken to thousands of people about the effects of circumcision. I was going to say men, but I've also talked to their partners, and to their children and to their parents, about the terrible regret and trauma that this causes to families and to couples and to parents and children. And it's so sad because it's so unnecessary. Right now, there's a couple from Florida who I'm in contact with a lot, and they have started to speak out. They have an 18-month-old son, and the father was thought he should be circumcised. So, and the mother didn't want that to happen, and a doctor chipped in with his opinion that it wouldn't hurt a bit and it would be better. So they went ahead with it, and it caused a tremendous breakdown in their marriage, and they're struggling to keep their marriage together. And then, of course, the really terrible thing is, one of the terrible things is, they're worried about their son. They're worried about explaining to him, because if you don't know anything, then, you're probably not worried about explaining it. But once you've become aware, then, this is something you're going to need to deal with. But then the father is also dealing with his own guilt about his son. He's dealing with having betrayed his wife by not listening to her, and he's dealing with his own circumcision grief. And meanwhile, his wife, who should is sympathetic to him, is also furious at him, and really doesn't have any room for dealing with his grief. And then her associated grief at realizing that he's not complete. So it's just this cascading series of realizations. And this is all, Sarah, this is all apart from the physical, right?
Yeah.
Because this child, this 18-month-old, is a happy baby.
Mm-hmm.
One can hope that he will, grow up to be a happy, functional in every way, boy and man. So there's nothing. I mean, he did not lose more than his foreskin
right.
in the surgery, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of an ordinary circumcision. He's not botched. So when they went to consider legal action against the physician for having really misled them, right? The lawyers wouldn't even consider it because the child's, not botched.
Wow.
Except that he is, because he's missing his foreskin, right? So all of this, is just preliminary. This is, and so unnecessary, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we just left our babies with their healthy, normal bodies, instead of being compelled to chop off some part of it, we wouldn't have to worry about any of this. Then they'd just be fighting about what everybody else fights about, whether it's money or religion or whether to move or remodel or something. But instead, there's this horrible thing that happened, and both parents, immense grief and fear for the future of their child. And then this man's, dealing with his own feelings of betrayal and his own injury and his own worry about, his own sexual function and what it means for him over time. Mm-hmm. So it's just...
Now, we may need a content warning on this next bit, but I think it's important for people to know what kind of harm there actually is in these routine circumcisions. And before we get into this, your group was kind enough to send over some photos to me of babies strapped into this circumstraint.
Oh, God.
And it's actually, I mean, I'm not going to show you all of them, guys. They're basically a step-by-step of the procedure, right? So I picked out some of the lesser ones for you to, right? So you've got the baby strapped in here strapped down to this board so they can't move their hands and legs.
As the circumstraint company advertises, a 4-point restraint with gentle Velcro straps. So 4-point restraint, of course, what we brag about using on prisoners, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and let me just mention to you, Sarah, that there are lots and lots and lots of videos online of circumcisions. And I, who after, decades of thinking about this, I cannot watch them. I just finally came to terms with the fact that I will never watch circumcision video ever again.
I don't think I could. Nope. I'm glad they didn't take me back.
Right.
Right. But, parents who are going to circumcise their sons, who've made a decision to circumcise, should be asked to watch video before they
that's a great idea. Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, then if they refuse to do that, that should tell them something. If you can't watch the video, I mean, and then somebody said, well, you wouldn't watch a video of open heart surgery if you're going to have open heart surgery. Well, one thing is maybe you would, but you presumably need open heart surgery, right?
Yeah.
So watch the video or don't watch the video, but this is a medical procedure. Again, circumcision is not a medical procedure. It's just torture.
What are some of the things that can happen? I think I read a story on the website about a baby who screamed so hard he had a hernia.
Yeah.
What other kinds of things are common?
So if it's okay with you, I will describe what happens in a circumcision physically, and then some of the. All right. So again, as I mentioned earlier, or I think I mentioned earlier, the foreskin is attached to the head of the penis in an infant, with the same kind of tissue that our fingernails and toenails are attached to the nail bed. It's called synechial tissue. And in order to be able to circumcise a baby, to cut off his foreskin, the first thing that you need to do is detach that foreskin from the head of the penis. And that is done with a metal probe that's inserted exactly as though you were detaching a fingernail from a nail bed. Exactly.
Becca's headphones are off already. Yeah.
Okay, so a metal probe is inserted and rammed under the foreskin and then basically sawed around the entire circumference of the penis between the foreskin and the glans. The glans is the kind of acorn-looking head of the penis, of the denuded penis, right? Mm-hmm. And that causes as much pain as it would if somebody was detaching your fingernail from the nail bed in a newborn, in somebody who's been only on this earth for a few days, maybe in some cases even only a few hours. And there is no anesthetic that can safely be given to a baby that will block all the pain. And in fact, for many decades, circumcision was carried out with absolutely no anesthetic.
Oh,
now, a lot of doctors and hospitals are using sugar, glucose pacifier, which, imagine going to the podiatrist for an ingrown toenail again and having them give you a Tootsie Roll Pop for pain. Or Emla cream, which is a topical which does not block all the nerve sensation. It takes a long time to take effect, and a lot of hospitals won't use it because it takes too long. Or an injection into the base of the penis, 3 injections actually, which is a block, a penile block. Also not 100% effective, although probably the most effective, but again, involving 3 unanesthetized injections into the base of the penis, and all, of course, totally unnecessary. So the first step of the procedure is to detach the foreskin from the glands. And then usually a clamp is put onto the foreskin to keep it from bleeding, and then some other kind of severing clamp is used. There are several of them. One is called a Gomco clamp. There's another one called a Mogan clamp, which has been implicated in many, many circumcision injuries. And then there's something called a Plastibell, which can be put on your son's penis and he's sent home with it and it falls off in a week or 2. Now, this is just what this newborn baby needs, right? So, and they basically all result in the severing of the foreskin. So, what can go wrong? You're operating on a very tiny body part. And just as no 2 adult penises are the same, no 2 baby penises are the same. And most of the doctors who do circumcisions are not trained penis specialists. They are often OBGYNs. And there's a medical school joke, which is watch one, do one, teach one.
Whoa.
Right. So you should know, parents who are thinking about doing this should know that there are very few. Probably, we talked earlier, probably a trained moil, a Jewish circumciser has actually more training, in circumcision than a doctor does. So, too much tissue can be taken off, too much foreskin, which results in very, very tight erections. Sometimes so much foreskin is removed because the foreskin is just part of the penis. It's not this separate thing that has a little red dotted line that says trim here, right? So if you pull down too much foreskin into the clamp, then the boy, when he starts to get sexually mature, you've actually pulled down scrotal tissue. So you wouldn't know that in a newborn, but then the person will have hair on the shaft of his penis, which is very painful during intercourse for both partners. You could have the man could have very tight, painful erections, bent penis. The most common circumcision complication that's extraordinarily rare in an intact male is meatal stenosis, which is the blood flow to the tip of the penis is interrupted, so it becomes stenosed, it becomes narrow, and it can result in inability to urinate, or boys or men who urinate in a split stream and don't know why. That's always meatal stenosis, which has caused the urinary opening to close up in part. Then, of course, all of these are all in the realm of normal circumcision complications.
Wow.
Then there are not infrequent terrible bleeding. Again, you're operating on a newborn. There could be a bleeding disorder, or because Nobody knows what the blood supply to any individual baby's penis is like. You can hit a major vessel instead of a minor vessel, and the mother takes the baby home, and the diaper is completely full of blood, and just a couple of teaspoons of blood loss in an infant can cause shock and death. That's the biggest cause of circumcision-related deaths, would be bleeding. And people are extremely unaware of that, and often these cases, the parents will have contacted the doctor or the hospital and been told not to worry. That, you know, little bleeding is normal, but little bleeding in adults not the same as little bleeding in a baby. Then you can have severing the glands of the penis, all or part of it, or more of the penis, and this is something that is more common when a Mogan clamp is used. And Mogan's actually, one of the manufacturers of Mogan clamp went out of business because of lawsuits, yet they continue to make them, different manufacturers, and continue to use them despite the fact that there have been so many reported injuries. So those are just some of the things that can immediately go wrong. Then of course, there are long-term complications, like I mentioned. Well, actually, I did mention some of the long-term complications, like hair on the shaft of the penis and painful bent erections, chafing, and then the consequence. The normal circumcised penis and a normal, perfectly executed circumcision always results in a scar, and always results in the eventual keratinization of the head of the penis, because the foreskin keeps the head of the penis soft and moist and pliable. That's the way it's supposed to be. And so if you remove that, the constant abrasion on the clothing of a boy and then a man results in desensitization, basically callousing, right?
Wow.
On the head of the penis. So there's very little research, but I think there will be more in the future. That is, to me, doubtless one of the causes of sexual dysfunction among adults.
Interesting.
And increasing complaints of dryness and performance issues in older couples. The man often is blamed for, banging and excessive, kind of activity in order to have an orgasm. And we just don't hear that among partners of intact men. There are other reasons for it, I'm sure, personal and psychological, but very compelling evidence that it's because normal sensitivity is not there. And so men have to work much, much harder just to feel something and reach an orgasm. Wow.
Yeah.
And, we haven't done cross-cultural studies on, and sexual, as you certainly know, sex research is very complex, right?
Yeah.
And very subjective. But the use of artificial lubricants in sex is off the charts in the U.S. compared to Europe, where men are not circumcised.
Wow.
And again, we don't know exactly why, it could have just to do, but it's generally, I would be very surprised if the main reason for this is not related to the fact that most American adult men are circumcised and most European adult men are not.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So you don't need most American men, it's my understanding, I shouldn't say that the use of lubricant is very common for masturbation in this country. Mm-hmm. And I've heard from European colleagues who work on, this issue, who are aware of this issue, that is not true in Europe. And the use of lubricant for sex is also much more frequent and more common in the U.S. than in countries where men are not circumcised. Right. Again, we don't have objective data on why this is, but I think it's not a far stretch to say that removing the body part that protects the penis and keeps it moist and soft must have some, consequence.
Sure, and knowing how the foreskin moves during the actual action of intercourse, we don't have the studies, but it sounds like common sense to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, every body part is there. There's no, just like what are the parts of your body that guarantee perpetuation of the species, right? Because that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
It's your mouth and your genitals, right? You can live with no arms, no legs. You can live blind, right?
Yeah.
But you have to ingest food and you have to be able to procreate, right? So, to mess with the genitals is really kind of astonishing, right? To think that somehow they were badly designed, so that half of all babies are born needing correction. Now, people do, dress up and, as you know, do lots of other things with their genitals once they're of an age to make a decision as to what makes them feel good, right?
Yes,
what turns them on, right? That's fine. But you can't be doing that to little babies.
Now,
you have to be aware that you're changing form and function and what the consequences of that is, and babies cannot make that decision.
Yes, absolutely. Now, that was a lot of information, and there was a lot of heavy information. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the organization Intact America and what some of those conversations are like with doctors, and maybe we can figure out why circumcision is so prevalent in America, yet almost all of Europe has done away with it, and look at us like a bunch of fools. More Sarah Talk after this.
In today's health-conscious society, you have many beverage choices, but do you know what's in all of them? So much sugar, sodium, and things you can't even pronounce. Dihydrogen monoxide. What's that? Sometimes you wish you just had a simple, more elegant solution for your beverage needs. Introducing H2O, the first ever chemical-free thirst quencher. H2O is simple, simply composed of 3 portions of 2 elements, hydrogen and oxygen. H2O means chemical-free, unlike water, which is filled with all sorts of shit. When we tested H2O, we found traces of no other elements. So pure, the bottle may as well be fucking empty, with all the same nutritional content as a breath of cool mountain air. First widely featured on Goop.com, actress Gwyneth Paltrow revealed that she exclusively uses H2O for her vaginal steaming process. After all, why use water when you can steam it with H2O? So now we invite you to run out to your local garden hose and drink that shit. Remember, it's not water, it's H2O.
H2O bottled by Flint Bottling Company in Flint, Michigan. Product not actually endorsed by Goop or Gwyneth Paltrow. Please do not use H2O for vaginal steaming, or better yet, please do not steam your vagina. H2O is actually just water. Water is a set of molecular compounds. It's a chemical. Everything is a chemical.
I was feeling so alone.
I'm glad I asked for help. Whatever it is, ask for help.
If you're thinking about suicide or need support, call the Trevor Lifeline at 1-866-488-7386.
Want to join the conversation or tell Sarah she's wrong? Email producer@SarahTalk.com or call 224-40-SARAH. That's 224-407-2724. Now, more Sarah Talk.
Welcome back to Sarah Talk. I'm Sarah Austin. We are speaking today with Georganne Chapin, the Executive Director of Intact America. Now, part of the activism work that you do involves educating medical professionals, and we kind of mentioned this a little earlier, but my experience with the doctors and nurses, and this was, so in the hospital, and Becca doesn't really remember a whole lot of this at all.
I had a C-section.
Yeah.
Wow.
But,
Right.
but it was really like the doctor came in and said, this is not a thing that we do here in the hospital. It's a you go to your doctor thing. Some people do it, some people don't. It's really basically your choice, and we can't tell you what to do. Right. What does, I'm going to guess it's lacking or completely just not there at all. What does the law look like, or hospital policy say about, you mentioned earlier the doctor that recommended, yeah, you should, it doesn't hurt, no big deal, let's do it. What does the law and hospital policy say about that?
It's really all over the place, but in essence, circumcision violates all kinds of bioethical rules and even hospital and medical rules when it comes to consent, because informed consent is supposed to be from the person who's going to live with the consequences of whatever the action is, except if the life or health of a child, for example, is at risk, or the life or health of somebody who cannot consent is at risk. And then you can have a substitute decision maker. The weird thing about circumcision is that the life and health of the baby is not at stake. This is a purely cosmetic and cultural surgery, but it's so deeply embedded in American medicine that it's basically been given a pass over all these decades. So I've seen hospital consent forms, that for one thing, no one reads them, right?
Of course,
no.
Sure.
So, and the solution is not to develop a better consent form, because the parents should have the job of the parents is to protect their children's rights, right? Not just to protect their bodies, but to protect their children's rights, preserve their children's rights. So no amount of information on a consent form for a medically unnecessary procedure on a child is going to be valid. But I've seen consent forms that say, condition to be treated, and then it says presence of foreskin.
Oh my God.
Right? Yeah.
What?
So again, this is something that it's something that you cannot sum up in any few sentences, what the rules are in different hospitals, even who does it, what people are told. But the point is, nobody should be selling a circumcision. Nobody should be saying, if no one had come up to you and said, now, do you want him circumcised?
Right.
That's solicitation. That's like, you walk into a store and they say, would you like to try our, lip gloss or something? They're selling, right? That's okay in a store. You can decide. But they shouldn't be selling circumcisions, and they continue to. The other point is that most medical professionals are not educated about the foreskin. Most male doctors don't have one. Now, although this is changing, right? Mm-hmm. Because, younger men they're more intact younger men, but most older male doctors don't have a foreskin. It was taken away from them when they were babies. And then if doctors have done circumcisions over the years, there's a lot of denial, about the damage that it causes. Denial or just repression, right, of awareness. How can you do that to a baby and not hear the screams?
Right.
But in medicine, you're taught to turn off to the patient's distress in a lot of cases, because what you're doing is necessary for the patient. In this case, it's not necessary. And
I couldn't imagine being that doctor and then having to go to sleep that night. I would hear those screams in my nightmares.
Mm-hmm.
Right. One wonders if they do or don't,
Yeah.
I've heard doctors and nurses say, oh, they sleep through the circumcision. I've heard, look, they used to do open heart surgery on babies with only curare to paralyze them, because they said babies didn't feel pain. Anyone who says that, any mother or any parent, right? Any parent knows babies feel pain. I remember discovering that my son's onesie, that the zipper was all the way up at the top, and it was instead of the zipper pull being down, it was up, and it was poking into his neck. And he kept screaming and screaming. I couldn't figure it out. Finally, I saw that. And he was a tiny baby, right? You're gonna tell me, they say, oh, it doesn't cause pain. They just don't like being strapped down. Or people will say babies sleep through it. And of course, that is always the result of a child going into shock, screaming so hard, or just going into shock in some kind of dissociative state. Let me just mention, I'm doing a lot of talking.
No, please.
That there are there's lots of evidence now about the long-term negative impacts of circumcision. There's the physical stuff I talked about, the meatostenosis and the sexual dysfunction. But in the International Journal of Human Rights earlier this year, there was an article published written by Tim Hammond and Adrian Carmack. Adrian is a urologist, a medical doctor, urologist, about long-term adverse outcomes from neonatal circumcision. Mm-hmm. They did a survey of more than 1,000 men and talked to them about their feelings about having been circumcised and both their physical and psychological consequences of having been circumcised. And if you read that, it's just incredibly compelling evidence that this is not a benign procedure. Even if this were the only 1,000 men, right, who felt like this, the justification for a medically unnecessary surgery just is not there. And of course, there are millions of men who are becoming aware of this issue and saying, I've had men tell me, in some ways I wish I had never become aware, I wish I was still blissfully ignorant. But once they know, the consequences are really quite devastating. And then men have to work through that, or not, but whichever it is, right? So there is lots of material about, being published. There's another book published by a man from New Zealand. It's called Unspeakable Mutilations. And again, it's, 150 pages of anecdotes. And this would be a different, base of men who are talking about the impact of circumcision on their physical and emotional well-being and their relationships.
Just an aside, that's another one of those things that I think is maybe not uniquely American culturally, but we talk a lot about, picture that awkward conversation in the TGIF sitcom where the dad is having this awkward conversation with his son about the birds and the bees. And like we are repressed so much in just talking about our bodies and sexuality. This is just another, maybe a deeper kind of layer to that.
It is, because often, if that child has been circumcised, and then if the parent is really quite ignorant about it, you've got a conversation that's just fraught with emotional distress, right? And the ignorance also makes it so hard for people to even explain. And then on top of it is, I know there are a lot of men who I've talked to who said, when I first heard about circumcision, my thought was, I am so glad my parents would never do that to me. And then the immediate realization, oh my God, they did that to me. How did that happen? So yeah, just as doctors, are in denial about what they're doing to babies, parents understandably go into denial about the decision they made. Sarah, could we take just a second, because you kind of alluded to it and I kind of said, yeah, but what the history of medical circumcision is in America? Because I think that's really helpful for people to understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I'll try to be really brief about it, but our founding fathers of America were all intact and they seem to be, just fine, So we can safely assume that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the Native Americans and and pretty much people all over the world, but certainly in American history, men were intact. In the mid 1800s, in the Victorian era, where lots of things happened. This was pre-Freud, and people started to be very concerned about sex and not just morality, but it was believed that masturbation and excessive sexual activity caused the human body to dissipate in its energy. So if anyone saw the movie The Road to Wellville, that was about Kellogg, the cereal guy, and his spa in, I believe it's in Michigan, where people, were encouraged to eat vegetarian and not masturbate, basically, and not have sex. So it was recognized that it was recognized that boys did a lot of masturbation and girls too, and it was thought that that was very unhealthy, and that the solution for that was to remove the source of pleasure, and removing the foreskin would cause boys not to touch themselves anymore, not to masturbate. Well, of course, it doesn't work. Everybody pretty much masturbates.
Sure.
But foreskin removal in adolescence was promoted and that was like the kind of the original, that became like the moral hygiene argument, that it was kind of immoral to masturbate. And that was for adolescent boys and girls. And then over the next few years, they kind of started doing circumcisions earlier and earlier. And when obstetrics became a specialty and childbirth moved into the hospital, one of the things that doctors started to do as part of the tricks of their trade was to circumcise infants. Because if it's good to remove, the foreskin from teenagers, it's even better to remove it early when they can't run away from you, right? You can strap them down
and they get the business.
And they get the business, and it made its way into fee-for-service medicine. This was not at Britain, of course, as a country with, Victorian tradition. I mean, that's really where it came from, with Queen Victoria, right? Also was circumcising, much as America was. But then by the Second World War, when it was really ramping up in the U.S., Britain adopted a national health service and made decisions not to cover medically unnecessary procedures. And there were a couple of very influential British physicians and a very famous midwife named Penelope Leach, who had recognized at that point that circumcision was not medically necessary and that the foreskin had a function, a positive function and a role. So Britain just gave up on it, and the U.S. just kept going with it. Other English-speaking countries followed the route of Britain. Australia, a little less. There's still some circumcision in Australia, but New Zealand gave it up. All the Commonwealth countries. Canada is a little mixed, kind of follows American geography. So, but it basically went by the wayside in these other countries and persisted as part of fee-for-service medicine in the U.S. And then we taught the South Koreans and the Filipinos to do it too as part of our military occupation of those countries. So those countries and the U.S. are really the only countries where circumcision is part of a routine, part of the childbirth routine.
That is so interesting.
Really?
Yeah. So people tell you that, it's that doctors do it, so it must be necessary. Of course, they don't realize that doctors started doing it as a way to keep boys from masturbating, not because, and then there were all these other justifications that followed, that it prevented hip dysplasia, it prevented blindness. Well, people used to think that masturbation caused blindness, right? So, sure, circumcision prevented blindness by preventing masturbation, right? Things that people would have no trouble identifying as totally ridiculous, but they're just not aware of the history.
Sure. Wow. Well, this is such an important topic. And God, if you can't change the doctors' minds, at least hopefully parents can get access to better education at a minimum. So, I'm really thankful.
That's what Intact America is aiming for.
Yeah.
We really are, not just parents, but the public in general, because parents listen also. They listen to their own parents. They listen to, they listen to popular culture. So we are really trying to reach to the mainstream so that we can achieve that tipping point, so that it becomes, unpopular to circumcise your baby, so that people realize it's just, not only is it not necessary, it's not desirable, it's not cool. And that is what Intact America, we are trying to change the way America thinks about circumcision. And I think we're being very successful, actually. I think we're going to reach a tipping point. And I doubt circumcision will ever be outlawed in this country for various reasons, including its religious.
Yep.
But I think that we will reach the point where parents of newborns will say, "Oh, no, I'm not doing that." That can't happen soon enough. I mean, we just need to make that happen.
Absolutely. And, I have long been a proponent of things like refuting bad science. Crystals don't have healing powers. Vaccines don't cause autism. And so this is probably the newest one on my list, but I am right there with you, and I will gladly claim the label of intactivist.
That's wonderful. I so appreciate you doing the show. I think it's just great. Everybody needs to hear that circumcision affects everybody, whether you have a penis of your own or not, whether you're the parent of it affects everybody because it's such a pervasive practice in our culture. It affects us in terms of what we pay for medical care.
Mm-hmm.
It affects us in how we deal with each other, how we deal with people of our lovers and our friends. So I really applaud you for dealing with this issue on your program. I just want to tell people again, we're on Facebook as Intact America. There's a Facebook group called Intact America. That's not us. We're a Facebook page. And you'll know the difference. We have about 50,000 followers. And then there's our website, intactamerica.org. And also, your listeners can reach me on my email address, or actually comes to me, info@intactamerica.org. And we definitely answer people's personal questions about themselves or about their babies. We try to get them the resources they need if they have questions. One of the biggest questions we get is about forcible foreskin retraction. Doctors tell them they have to retract their son's foreskin. Never. There's only one answer to that. No, you do not need to retract your son's normal foreskin. It'll retract on its own in time. So we get a lot of questions about that. And, people should feel free to contact us, info@intactamerica.org, about anything they want to know.
Excellent. And I'll have that information on the show notes of this episode 67. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us and helping educate both ourselves and our audience. That was a lot of really great information.
It's been my pleasure. And good luck to all of you in everything that you do. You're doing great work.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Georganne Chapin, Executive Director of Intact America. That was a lot of really great information.
Yes.
And if you're still here and you hung through the graphic part of that, thanks for sticking around, because, that was the history was very interesting. But, in light of our own experience, we're going to have this seemingly difficult, although it shouldn't be, conversation with our kids at some point when they're older, of course. But if they choose to have kids, I want them armed with information, and I want them to make their own choices, not just because that's what we do and because the doctor says it doesn't hurt. So again, Georganne, thank you so much for coming on the show. We want to give a big special shout out to our patrons, Russell, Andrea, Jeremy, Harry, Heather, and Josie. As always, thank you so much for supporting the show and helping us get information out like this to people. It's very important. So thank you for that. That's going to do it for this episode, and we'll see you next week. This is SarahTalk.
SarahTalk is made possible by listener support. Visit patreon.com/SarahTalk to become a patron and help keep this program going. Contact Sarah and Company by email at producer@sarahtalk.com or call 224-40-SARAH. That's 224-407-2724. And follow us on social media, facebook.com/SarahTalkRadio and on Twitter @SarahTalkRadio. SarahTalk is a production of Sarah Austin Media.
We want to give a big special shout out to our patrons, whose names I don't know off the top of my head, so hold on. I've got some editing to do on this one.